Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this third meeting on Egyptian myths and mysteries. As we said, we will briefly go over what was presented in the previous meeting with a few more images about cosmic, earthly, and human evolution. In this diagram are represented the 7 states of consciousness, the 7 states of life, and the 7 states of form, as well as the 7 cultural epochs and the 7 eras. Don't worry about the fact that they are called periods of civilization. We normally call those eras, as also indicated in parentheses, and cultural epochs. Thus, we have 5 sevenfold levels. We can say 5 sevenfold arcs of development. The first one, the states of consciousness, is called metamorphosis of the earth or incarnations of the earth. Then we have the 7 states of life and the 7 states of form, where life and form evolve progressively. Below that, we find the 7 earth eras, of which earth is composed, and in each era, 7 cultural epochs. We will keep this diagram as a general reference. It is taken from Joris Velcic's website, Anthropos, Conosci te stesso. And as you can see, the past is in magenta and the future in green. Here we have at a glance everything that is the past evolution and everything that is the future evolution. And as you see, we are in the 4th stage, which is the central one as regards the states of consciousness, the states of life, the states of form, as well as the Earth's era, but we are instead in the 5th post-Atlantean era. So there is a mistake here in the 4th, going down the column. And then we get to the 5th cultural epoch. So we have 4 stages, along which Rudolf Steiner led us in the previous conferences when speaking about the metamorphosis of the earth, the states of life, and the states of form, about which he did not go into depth, but that were implicit. Then he led us into the passage from the Polarian era to the Hyperborean, Lemurian, Atlantean, and post-Atlantean. And finally, he mentioned that what went on after the Great Flood, the Indian, Persian, Egyptian, Chaldean, Greco-Roman, or Greco-Latin cultural epochs up to the current one. Last time, I described the metamorphosis of the earth, and in particular the passage from unity to duality to trinity. Here we take them up again with this image that I drew that offers an impression in a single image of this passage from unity to duality to trinity. If you remember, we said that in the first incarnation of the earth, ancient Saturn, everything was combined in a unity. And the same was true in the second incarnation of the earth, which is ancient Sun. And you see here that there's a single mass, so to speak. The first on the top left is ancient Saturn. The second is ancient Sun. In ancient Saturn, the centripetal forces prevail. In ancient Sun, there is a balance between centripetal forces and centrifugal forces. So let's say Saturn was heat and darkness, and the Sun had both zones of heat and darkness and zones of radiant light, therefore centripetal and centrifugal forces. It was only in the third incarnation of the Earth, called Ancient Moon, which you see here in the third image above, that the Sun separated from the mass of the Earth Moon. So you see that the radiant mass, therefore centrifugal of the Sun, separates from the more centripetal mass of the Earth-Moon, which here are in yellow and blue. So you see, up to ancient Sun, they were superimposed, and then they separate, and a duality is formed. The cosmos that was evolving remained in unity, as I was saying, up to ancient Sun, and it entered into duality in ancient Moon. The same process was then recapitulated in a similar way within the present metamorphosis of the Earth, where not only was there a state of unity, duality, and trinity, but a state that we call multiplicity was reached, and with it a further splitting of the forces. Therefore, in the recapitulation that occurred within a single metamorphosis of the Earth, our fourth metamorphosis, you can see this sequence here. We have used these two diagrams in other seminars, but it is just to give you an image. We see the sequence of the eras of the Earth. On the light purple line, you see Polarian, Hyperborean, Lemurian, Atlantean, present, then 7 seals and 7 trumpets, the 7 eras of the Earth. Here, we must keep in mind that the macrocosmic process that we saw before is recapitulated. Therefore, ancient Saturn, ancient Sun, ancient Moon, and then current Earth within the present Earth herself through the earthly eras. We start with the first era of the Earth, the Polarian era, where Sun, Earth, and Moon were united. And here you see it. And the human being was passing the mineral stage of its evolution. We move then to the second era, the Hyperborean, in the middle of which the Sun separated from the mass of the Earth-Moon, and the human being was then passing the plant stage of its evolution. Then, as in ancient Moon, the separation in the Hyperborean era came into being, you remember, because some spiritual entities, the more evolved angelic hierarchies, could find an environment for their faster evolution only on the Sun. In the Hyperborean era, the Sun was the highest and most spiritual environment, and the evolution of the Sun was guided by a sublime entity that, as we said, the Gnostics called pleroma or pleroma, which is the fullness of the Elohim, hierarchy of the Sun. Had it not been so, the more evolved hierarchies would have remained behind in evolution, unable to donate their creative action to the cosmos, unable to radiate in the cosmos. And so other, less evolved hierarchies, together with the human being, remained in the environment that was suitable for them, the Earth-Moon mass. On the Earth-Moon mass, only the human being and the higher entities, angels and archangels, remained, and we will talk more about them in this meeting. The Earth-Moon was the lowest environment, even lower than our present Earth, because it had not yet freed itself from the mass of the Moon. It was only in the middle of the Lemurian era, you see it here, the Lemurian era, that, being a recapitulation of ancient Moon in the present incarnation of the Earth, Earth freed herself from the mass of the Moon. The mass of the Moon was extracted by the spirit of the Moon, Jehovah, who detached itself from the Elohim and drew out the lunar forces from the Earth in order to allow the Earth to reach her intermediate speed of evolution, so to speak. Here in the fourth image, you can see Earth between the radiant centrifugal forces of the Sun in yellow and the retrograde centripetal forces of the Moon. We also said that the Sun is 2 stages ahead in evolution, the Moon is 1 stage back, and the Earth is in between. Thus, we get this configuration. Similarly, you see here the Polarian era as the unity, the Hyperborean era with the separation of the sun, the Lemurian era with the expulsion of the moon, and at this point, the Trinity is created of sun, moon, and earth, which characterizes the whole evolution of the Atlantean era following Lemuria. Lemuria is destroyed by fire in the catastrophe of fire. Atlantis is destroyed by water in the Great Flood. If you're passionate about the past of our Earth, you may have heard that the destruction of Lemuria by fire corresponds in a physical sense to the event that occurred 65 million years ago at the so-called Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary, known as dinosaurs' extinction, the extinction of known avian dinosaurs. The other subsequent catastrophe, the Great Flood, corresponds again in a physical sense to the melting of all the ice caps during the last ice age in what is known in geology as Younger Dryas. Now, in this conference, we go back to talking about the Atlantean era. So let me show you again this diagram of the evolution in 5 sevenfold periods of time so that you can gradually orient yourself. Rudolf Steiner devotes this third lecture almost entirely to describing Atlantis, in particular the state of consciousness and perceptions of the ancient Atlanteans, as well as their evolution. Let's begin. The souls that had lived during Atlantis, as you know, were reincarnated in the subsequent cultural epoch after the flood. After the Great Flood, then, it is always the same souls that are reincarnated, from Lemuria to Atlantis to after Atlantis. This means that the Atlantean civilization of the Atlantean era did not completely end with the flood, because a memory was imprinted in the souls that incarnated from era to era. As the Lemurian era had not ended, the Atlantean era did not end either, and it reappeared in a certain form in the post-Atlantean cultural eras. So, Lemuria leaves a sort of residue on which Atlantis is grafted. Atlantis leaves a residue on which post-Atlantis is grafted, in such a way, in particular, that in the last cultural epoch of the Atlantean era, which astrologically was the era of Leo, or we could also say in the last Atlantean subrace, because the subraces still prevailed in Atlantis, the races were already well differentiated and had retained high clairvoyant faculties. After the Great Flood, Steiner himself says that the word race, which has more to do with the physical, can no longer be used. That is why they are called cultural epochs. We can use the term peoples, or in a more modern sense, ethnic groups, when we refer to post-Atlantean times. Obviously, we have here a continuation of an evolutionary process that goes from being physical to becoming more cultural, more soul-based. These races that had differentiated at the end of the Atlantean era, in the last subrace of the Atlantean era, when migrating out of Atlantis, brought with them the Atlantean knowledge and became leaders of the peoples. So the seers, prophets, enlightened ones, and kings of the post-Atlantean cultural epochs were in fact the reincarnated souls of those who had experienced at the highest level a relationship with spiritual entities during sleep, during what was their night consciousness. These seers, prophets, enlightened ones, and kings were the least advanced souls, that is, those who had remained the most in the state of consciousness that was common before the Great Flood. The memory of Atlantis was still very much alive in an inner sense, having they retained the Atlantean clairvoyant faculties. Those who were more advanced, on the other hand, already had a consciousness that was beginning to resemble the humanity of the epochs following the flood. They had acquired a physical perception of the world, such that their consciousness was more similar to ours, though not yet identical. During the day, they saw objects already partly distinct and outlined, and the colors came to rest upon and feel the forms. You remember that for the Atlanteans instead, the forms were emptied of colors, and the colors radiated as a mist or a cloud around them. A small group of men, whom we can call the founders, led by the greatest initiate of the time, the Manu, the guide of humanity, and his disciples, had the task of founding new civilizations. So the Manu gave the impulses to found new civilizations, and the Manu was the highest initiate of the Oracle of the Sun, which we said was the harmonizing Oracle of Atlantis, the one that harmonized the supersolar planetary oracles, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, with the subsolar ones, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. This group of men, guided by the Manu, was led to Central Asia, so as to be isolated from the other groups of men who still retained the clairvoyance of the time before the flood. And from Central Asia, they sent civilizing impulses to all humanity. It was from these impulses that the post-Atlantean epochs arose after the Great Flood. This group of founders, led by the Manu, was the one that had lost the ancient clairvoyance that most, and had a day consciousness for which physical objects appeared with well-defined contours. Thus, separated from the others, this group was able to develop the most useful characteristics for the post-Atlantean civilizations. Out of this main group of disciples, the Manu then dispatched other founding groups led by initiates, who were in turn his highest disciples, to spread all over the world as pioneers of the new era after the flood, and to found the post-Atlantean civilizations. In the different places on Earth that they colonized, the founders of these new civilizations after the flood encountered the descendants of older civilizations. We talked about it in our previous meetings. So the group of founders, led by the Manu, joined other, more ancient peoples who still possessed the ancient clairvoyance. These founding impulses, put into effect by the initiates, were modulated in such a way as to harmonize the evolution of the most advanced souls with the most primitive ones. Thus, there was always a balance between these two tendencies, progressive and regressive, between those who had a perception of the physical world and those who still had a clairvoyant perception. There were also specific initiates, called the messengers, whose task it was to unite two groups with a different state of consciousness. So let's say that they were concerned with researching the most effective way of balancing two groups that had a polarity in their states of consciousness, one being more evolved and one less evolved. And so, thanks to this impulse of the Manu, of the founders, and of the messengers, a continuous balance of evolutionary conditions was brought into being, so that the traditions of the ancient civilizations created the preconditions for the successive civilizations in a metamorphosis that respected the times of evolution of those who were further back as well as of those who were further ahead. The most ancient religions were therefore in continuity with the most recent ones, so that the most evolved souls could experience the conceptions of the new post-Atlantean stream, while the less evolved ones still lived in a way similar to Atlantis. In particular, it was in northern India that an original pre-Vedic civilization developed, so before the Rig Veda, that is the Paleo-Indian epoch, and little by little the seeds of the subsequent civilizations were laid in Persia with the Paleo-Persian epoch and in Egypt with the Egyptian Chaldean epoch. In general, we know that in the fourth Atlantean era, during the night, the human being lived with the spiritual entities of angels and archangels, as well as with the elementary beings that were perceived as we perceive the realms of nature, mineral, plant, and animal. Later on, all of these spiritual beings and entities came to be called gods in the course of the Paleo-Indian, Paleo-Persian, Egypto-Chaldean, and Greco-Roman cultural epochs. In Atlantis, the souls met angels and archangels as companions in the spiritual world, in particular through the astral body and the eye, which were still floating outside of man. The gods on which the ancient polytheistic religions are based are therefore the memory of the spiritual entities perceived clairvoyantly in the Atlantean era through the astral body and the eye of the ancient Atlanteans. Perceptions that continued as a memory in the subsequent cultural epochs in India, Persia, and Egypt up to the fourth cultural epoch, the Greco-Roman. In the morning, at dawn, and during the day, the perception of the spiritual entities disappeared, and the human souls plunged into the physical body. Then the forms of the world appeared as if enveloped in a mist, so that the daytime human consciousness was, unlike the nighttime one, immersed in a haze. In this state of dreamy daytime clairvoyance, humanity was united with the etheric formative forces that still circulate in nature today, with the difference that today, unless we are on a path of initiation, we cannot perceive them. For them, instead, perceptions were what we call today synesthesia, that is, the union of different sensory perceptions. Synesthesia was the normal state of the Atlantean, while for us it is an exception. Moreover, when synesthesia manifests itself, it can be either have been attained through an initiatory path, as I mentioned, or it can be atavism, that is, the permanence of the very conditions of Atlantean consciousness. I will give you an example. Steiner gives one in this lecture. The union between sight and taste, between hearing and touch, that is, I could taste what I saw, touch what I heard, and, for instance, understand moral qualities through smell, and so on. This was the synesthetic state of consciousness of the ancient Atlanteans, a state of consciousness that, as I was saying, can endure in an atavistic sense even today, though rarely. One that continues to exist in certain populations still living in the group soul and can appear in a new form through the initiation process. Here Steiner gives an example. The sight of a body of water was also the tasting of the water itself. Why was this? Because since the etheric body of the Atlantean was still far outside the limits of the physical body, it could perceive the etheric formative forces of the water itself. And so the being that wove creatively into nature, everything that was the deed of creating nature, was totally filled with beings. In the case of water, for example, the Atlanteans perceived the undines, the nature beings of water, with their own characteristics, and the clairvoyant perception of the Atlanteans was revealed. This was also true for the other senses: taste, smell, touch, hearing, sight, and all the 12 senses, which were therefore more cosmic than contained, so to speak, within the limits of the human body, because the etheric body clearly overflowed outside the physical, and the astral body was even more somehow diffused in the cosmos around. And the eye obviously was outside the boundaries of the physical body. The senses were therefore united, superimposed on one another, so that one evoked the other in a unitary experience of earthly existence. The Atlanteans were therefore able to perceive the unity of nature that underlies the illusory multiplicity of nature, the Maya, which instead prevails today in our current sensory perception. We perceive multiplicity and not unity. For this reason, during the initiation process, we acquire the perception of the unity that underlies the multiplicity of nature, which is illusory. We do that by consciously returning to the Atlantean clairvoyant state of consciousness, thanks to the eye, in the four forces of consciousness of the eye. Steiner says that the Atlanteans could extend their feeling into the creatures and the things that were created in nature, and therefore unite with the perceived objects through perceptions, according to sympathy and antipathy. Sympathy for unity, for what was perceived as united, and antipathy for what was perceived as divided, for multiplicity. These ancient Atlanteans were continuously in the state of perception that today we call Gothian observation, although, unlike today, in a completely unconscious form. So the soul of the Atlantean was united with all of nature and its formative processes by means of such synesthetic perceptions, by means of the activity that we can call Gothian observation or also Rosicrucian observation. Therefore, for the Atlanteans, all nature was an animated unity, with its elements of fire, air, and water, which were still united, and earth, and it spoke a language that was comprehensible to their soul. The laws of the cosmos were imparted to the Atlantean through what is called the Tao, the spirit word, which resonated in the beings of nature, who in turn communicated to the Atlantean the laws of the cosmos. Human beings learned from this in their soul by imitation. As in an echo, they repeated the laws that were given to the soul by the beings of nature. And while during the day they experienced these elementary beings and the spiritual beings in nature, at night they encountered them directly as spirits, living in all the elements and in all of nature. For the ancient Atlanteans, all creation was animated and filled with spirit, and precisely the Tao, the spirit word, that resonated in nature. Hence, we understand that these were not mere beliefs. It was not that the Atlanteans believed in multiple gods, like in polytheism, as defined by the history of religions. Rather, they had supersensible perceptions. It's very different. In fact, it was thanks to such supersensible perceptions, so powerful, that the memories imprinted in the souls could remain for so long a time that they reappeared in the successive incarnations of these souls in subsequent eras. When the founders sent by Manu arrived in northern India, they met a population that still felt the world as animated, just like the ancient Atlanteans. They still perceived that everything was a unity beyond the illusion of multiplicity in the sense-physical world. Even today, we can observe a memory of this condition, for example, in children, who still live in the unity of things within the first 3 years of life. Forms are emptied, colors hover around in a mist, and in fact the child perceives in a recapitulation the same way as the ancient Atlanteans perceived. Then, after the child's third year, colors enter the form and the form takes on its outlined contours and our current perception is developed. This perceptive process, some of you may be interested in this, is preserved, for example, in some forms of autism, and as it is called today, in which subtle perceptions are maintained. And these extend not only to perceiving nature, but also human souls in a form that we can call telepathy, that is, hearing the thoughts of others. Often, subjects who are defined as autistic can repeat out loud the thoughts they hear. The same happens with their catching, for example, processes and influences that live in an environment, that animate that environment. They can put them into sentences because they caught them through a form of perception that is the remainder of an ancient Atlantean condition that has stuck. However, they're not able to communicate such experiences in the same form as was peculiar to the post-Atlantean era. In the same way, the ancient peoples retained such perceptions in the form of soul memories coming from past Atlantean incarnations. These were the initiates of the ancient mysteries after the Great Flood, and through the process of initiation, they awakened the ancient memories of their previous Atlantean incarnations together with their perceptions. So, in the ancient mysteries after Atlantis, the ancient memories of Atlantis were awakened in the souls of the initiates, because these souls had been so powerfully impressed by these spiritual entities, elementary beings, and forces of nature. Through initiation, they could resurrect them and attain anew a clearly unified perception of the world. So, let's say they were able to pass through the veil of illusion of the Maya and of multiplicity into unity. Then Steiner takes us further back and says that if we go back to the first half of the Atlantean era, we see clairvoyantly how the etheric man of the time was still sort of a floating being. We can see that he was made up of all his four constituent bodies, physical, etheric, astral, and I, and yet everything was in a loose state, so to speak. He was a predominantly supersensible man and still appeared in animal form. As you remember, in this image that we have mentioned, the animals of the Atlantean era gradually began to appear after the extinction of the great reptiles, the dinosaurs, at the end of the Lemurian era, which in fact can also be called the Age of Reptiles. In the Atlantean era, the human being that was taking form in the supersensible projected into the sense-physical world new animal forms that gradually evolved, thus characterizing the Atlantean era or Age of Mammals. You can see here the changes between evolutions. We spoke of evolution from fish to amphibians to reptiles and now mammals. So the etheric body was the largest and most mobile part of human beings, and starting with the Lemurian era, they differentiated into four archetypes. These four human group souls were similar to those of the animals that gradually appeared after the Lemurian era or Age of Reptiles. The eagle, that is to say all birds, the lion and the bull, and finally man himself. These are also the so-called symbolic figures of the four apocalyptic animals. They appear in the second apocalyptic seal, for instance, and are also associated with the four evangelists, as well as with the fixed signs of the zodiac, Taurus, Leo, Scorpio eagle, and man angel, that is Aquarius. So, We have to imagine that originally there existed various human group souls, in particular 3 of them, with the 4th that was more in balance. The first 3 referred to what we can call archetypes, to the archetype of the human being when it had passed the stage that had originated the birds, then to that of the lion, therefore all the carnivorous mammals, and to that of the bull, that is, the herbivorous mammals. Steiner specifies that those figures were not completely identical to those of today's animals. The images that are used for the evangelists and for the fixed signs of the zodiac are symbolic figures. We must understand that those figures were similar to the etheric formative forces that are still clairvoyantly observable in these beings today. So, if we clairvoyantly observe a bird, we find in it the configuration of etheric forces corresponding to the eagle and to the original eagle or bird group soul of humanity. The same is true for the lion and for the bull, which are respectively the carnivorous mammals and the herbivorous mammals. And so there were, in the first half of the Atlantean era, 4 distinct group souls, hence 4, we can say, Atlantean races, possessing distinct features that were similar to those of the corresponding animals, or better yet, possessing etheric formative forces similar to those that are present in the corresponding animals. So there were the man bull, who lived mainly in the reproductive and metabolic system and in the limbs. Then there were the man lion, who lived in the rhythmic, circulatory and respiratory systems. The man eagle, who lived in the neurosensory and nerve systems and in the sense organs. And what we call the man, or rather with the countenance of man, characterized by a balance of the etheric formative forces that were woven into the other 3 animal men, bull, lion, and eagle. Generally speaking, one type prevailed, but the other 3 were also present. There was a totally manifest primary animal, a secondary animal, a tertiary one, and finally a totally potential animal, the quaternary one, whose nature was opposite and complementary to the totality manifest primary one. Exactly in the same way in which today, for those who are interested in temperaments, those temperaments show up in the etheric body. There is a temperament that prevails over the other 3, and the quaternary one is in potential with respect to the primary manifest one, and is obviously complementary to that. So, if I have a fiery temperament, and therefore I am choleric, my complementary temperament will be phlegmatic, which is water. If I, vice versa, have a melancholic temperament, the totally potential one will be the opposite one of air, the sanguine. In this way, each compensates the other. So one is totally manifest, 2 are at different degrees of manifestation, and 1 is totally potential and is the opposite of the totally manifest one. In the first half of the Atlantean era, the human being lived mainly in the etheric body, but also in the astral body, which, as I was saying, was still very diffused in the cosmos. The I was still outside the human figure, hovering above it. The I will enter within the figure, within the confines of the physical body, in particular of the skull, at the end of the Atlantean era, with individuality we have called Noah, who is the Manu, the guide of humanity in the transition between the Atlantean and the post-Atlantean eras. From a sense-physical standpoint, we can say that the general Atlantean humanity showed animal traits. Then we must distinguish from this general humanity that still had animal traits, a humanity that gradually acquired the countenance of the human being. So there was the race of man eagle, the race of man lion, the race of man bull, and then there were some who had already taken on the face of man, the balance between the three group souls, eagle, lion, and bull. These were the disciples of the Atlantean oracles, the adepts of the Atlantean oracles, and the hierophants of the Atlantean oracles. These can be considered as three stages. The hierophants guided the Atlantean mysteries, the Atlantean oracles. The adepts were their first helpers, and the disciples were those who were in the process of gradually becoming adepts, and eventually some of them hierophants. Steiner here says something interesting. We must understand that nowadays it may be that an initiate be distinguished from the rest of humanity just by some physical traits that testify, in a certain sense, to his Atlantean past in a very direct way. In the physical body of today's initiates, it's only small characteristics that recall the hierophants of Atlantis. Instead, in the Atlantean era, the initiates differed greatly from the rest of the humanity of the time, because the majority of the Atlanteans possessed animalistic physical traits, while the initiates already had more harmonious human traits, similar to those that would appear later after Atlantis. There is this inversion. So, today's initiates, if they were Atlantean hierophants, would show traces in the body that remind of the characteristics of Atlantis. Instead, during the Atlantean era, the initiates of the oracles of Atlantis were those who were more human. This is very interesting because it is another reversal, like that of the consciousness, isn't it? We have a twilight consciousness at night, and we are in a waking state during the day, while for the Atlanteans it was exactly the opposite. The physique of the initiates of the oracles of Atlantis, then, was harmonious, just as their face was more similar to ours, to the post-Atlanteans. And so was the forebrain, the frontal lobes, these too more similar to our present ones. Therefore, the Atlantean initiates of the oracles of Atlantis were in general more similar to today's human beings than to the other Atlanteans, who were more animal-like. Where there was an excess metabolic system and limbs, they had traits that recalled the man-bull, an excess circulatory, respiratory, and cardiac systems, the man-lion, and an excess neurosensory system, the man-eagle. Today, we can say that the opposite is true. There are only subtle traces of the Atlantean past on the body of today's initiates, or rather of those who were obviously already hierophants in the Atlantean era. It is as if imprinted in their physical body were seals of the powerful experiences that their soul lived at that time during Atlantis. These come to manifestation in the sevenfold development of the human being, in particular during the first, second, and third 7-year periods. The first 3, and especially in the first, when these seals are imprinted in the physical body and represent a resurgence of the experiences that the Atlantean soul experienced in Atlantis. Then, secondly, in the etheric body and in the astral body. The Atlantean initiates, the hierophants in particular, directed the mystery schools associated with the oracles of the mysteries of Atlantis. So, initiation took place in the oracles of the mysteries of Atlantis, and then there were schools in which the aspects, so to speak, of knowledge and meditation were imparted, instructions on knowledge and meditation about what the mysteries were. The hierophants directly guided the adepts and the initiates according to a hierarchy to which corresponded both the inner life of the soul and the exterior life of the body, and therefore what happened internally was manifested externally. And the disciples of the mysteries of that time were preparing to leave behind them the most animalistic traits of their nature. They were getting ready to become countenance of man, therefore more human, we could say more modern. Thus, in the mysteries, the experiences of the Atlantean souls were prepared in an anticipatory form, in such a way that they would found the humanity of the successive cultural epochs once they returned in incarnation. As these experiences continued, however, the spirit was less and less able to penetrate the physical body, so much so that today, when we experience the hold of the spirit on the physical in facial expressions, laughter, crying, for example, all our various expressions, the movement of the head, the arms, the legs, all this is only something really minimal compared to how powerfully the physical was moved by the spirit at the time, by everything supersensible that was outside the physical. Let us remember that the astral and the etheric and the I were in fact still outside the physical body. Thus, thought and feeling, by acting from outside, could manipulate the physical more powerfully. Just so, to have an image, we can say that the I, the astral, and the etheric were like puppeteer, with the physical being their puppet. The processes of thought and feeling in particular were directed by the hierophants and the adepts and initiates of the mysteries to give the hierarchy of these 3 degrees of initiation and powerfully influenced the body of the disciples, organically modifying it in relatively short periods of time. So the schools of the mysteries gave such impulses in the souls of the ancient Atlanteans that their physical body changed in relatively short periods of time. This is how the disciples of the mysteries gradually assumed a human form, while the rest of the people remained in a relatively animal-like state. Thus, the most human were the hierophants, then the adepts, the initiates, and the disciples. The rest of Atlantean humanity maintained predominantly animalistic traits. The disciples gradually lost them and became initiates, then adepts, and then hierophants. This process of, we may say, purification from animal traits was instilled by the hierophants and the adept spiritual masters according to thoughts and feelings through a form of suggestion of the soul. They impressed from the outside in the soul of the Atlantean thoughts and feelings, so that these, resting in the soul of the Atlantean, impressed themselves in the physical, operating on the physical of the Atlantean. And here we must be very careful. What at that time was evolutionary would be counter-evolutionary today. Therefore, any form of suggestion operated from the outside that is practiced today and that is not in communion with the consciousness soul, which is our task to bring to maturity, would be a form of black magic in all respects, because it would in fact operate on the will of others, while in that remote past of humanity, it was the form of regular magic that the initiates of the mysteries of Atlantis operated on the disciples. So be careful. If the ancient Atlanteans did it, it doesn't mean that we do it today and it is the same. Yes, it does happen, but it is not regular. Again, the fact that it is a form of ancient magic that influenced souls, it doesn't mean that it is to be replicated today. Be careful about this because it clearly lends itself to misunderstanding if it is not specified. This is therefore how the initiates of the oracles of Atlantis operated in an evolutionary way by placing a thought form and a feeling form in the soul of the disciples. These thought and feeling forms were connected to a certain spiritual entity which, pouring its impulses into the Atlantean soul, induced a metamorphosis which then expressed itself and impressed itself outwardly on the physical. The thought form that was the object of the meditation induced by the initiates was the very human figure in a harmonious form, intended as an ideal future evolution. In fact, these disciples of the oracles of Atlantis meditated on the human figure and gradually took it in themselves, while losing the eagle, lion, and bull characteristics. In this way, therefore, the man-bull, the man-lion, and the man-eagle could all tend towards a human figure in which the formative process of the bull, the lion, and the eagle were in mutual harmony. We can also say that the metabolic, rhythmic, neurosensory processes were in mutual harmony. The thought form of man, of the countenance of man to be precise, allowed the physical body to be shaped while dissolving the animal traits that were still present, thus getting ever closer. And keep in mind that when Steiner says, in a relatively fast time, he means over the course of thousands of years to the present human physical body. This whole process begins with the end of the Lemurian era and continues throughout the Atlantean era, particularly in the first half. The mysteries of Atlantis, then, were the mysteries of the countenance of man and, by extension, of the human figure that transcended the external differences of the Atlantean races possessing animalistic features. The countenance of man was indicated as the great ideal to strive for, as well as the meaning of the earth, a form that it was possible to assume now that a new era had begun after the Lemurian era, which had ended. To the meditation on the countenance of man and the figure of man as archetypes, as a great ideal to strive toward for human and earthly evolution, a man in particular dedicated much of his life and art, Leonardo da Vinci. Both the Vitruvian Man and the Gioconda, the Mona Lisa, are precisely two images that have in themselves an archetype, superimposed onto various other elements that are typical of the transition between Renaissance and humanism. We see the human figure in the Vitruvian Man, and will find the countenance of man expressed even more than in the Mona Lisa, which reminds us above all of the soul of the earth, the soul of the world, in Leonardo's Christ, in this image that unites in itself both feminine and masculine traits, and which represents the archetype of the human being. So this meditation of the countenance of man and of the human figure is something that is always present and that we disregard every time we're not fully human in one way or another, every time we manifest animalistic traits. To summarize, the mysteries of Atlantis were the mysteries of the human figure and of the human countenance that transcended the external differences of the Atlantean races. To have a current image to contemplate, you can contemplate Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, in a certain sense also the Mona Lisa, and above all, the Salvator Mundi. The countenance of man was indicated as the great ideal to strive for, as well as the meaning of the earth, a form that it was possible to assume and which now gave rise to the new Atlantean evolution. It was understood how this countenance of man could have come into being thanks first to the separation of the sun and then to the separation of the moon, so as to allow the evolutionary trajectory of the earth to maintain its proper speed. This process of the human figure and of the countenance of man continued until the middle of the Atlantean era and even after the Great Flood, so that all the ancient mysteries were a continuation of the Atlantean mysteries, although in a new form. Thus, the ancient Indian initiate, when he addressed Brahma, had precisely this as his image, the human figure in its entirety, and the taking on of the one human countenance in particular. Thus, Brahma is, for the ancient Indian, the meaning of earth and of man in its entirety. At this point, we have completed our comment on the whole third lecture, but I would like us to go deeper into this last part, into some of the occult aspects of evolution within the Atlantean era. We have seen that the Hierophants were in a more intimate contact with the spiritual entities that guarded the oracles of Atlantis, that is, they were the custodians of the celestial spheres, of the spheres of the planets. Second to them were the adepts, then the initiates, and finally the disciples, who were breaking away from the general population of ancient Atlanteans. The Hierophants could enter into communion with the spiritual entities of the angels and archangels, that is, the angels and archangels manifested themselves through them. It is as if their soul was a door through which the spiritual entities could manifest themselves, because by virtue of their occult constitution, the Hierophants could offer a greater sacrifice of themselves, we can say. Therefore, angels and archangels, the gods, poured themselves into the Hierophants, making themselves manifest to the disciples. The adepts had a knowledge and perception of these spiritual entities and served the oracles as assistants to the Hierophants. The initiates carried out the instructions given to them and spread these instructions among the various races. They were precisely the messengers we spoke of before. The oracles of Atlantis were entirely conducted at the time by the descendants of Abel, also called the sons of Abel or sons of God, who possessed a higher degree of clairvoyance. This actually prevailed until the mystery of Golgotha, in particular until the completion of the initiation of John the Evangelist. These sons of Abel or sons of God were opposed by the sons of Cain, or sons of man, that is, those who had descended more deeply into the physical plane and whom Steiner already described in this lecture. Therefore, the events in Genesis which describe the killing of Abel by Cain occurred in the first half of the Atlantean era, while the events concerning Seth, who was the substitute son given by Jehovah in place of the slain Abel, occurred as a process around the middle of the Atlantean era. These events, the killing of Abel by Cain and the replacement with Seth, the golden legend, actually mean a clash of civilizations, the civilizations more linked to the sense-physical plane, the sons of Cain or of man, began to overwhelm those that still had maintained a greater clairvoyance, the sons of Abel or of God. They were more in communion with spiritual entities. For this reason, they were called sons of God. The killing of Abel by Cain marked a first entry of the Ahrimanic forces into the human etheric body, which at the time was still deeply united with that of the earth, because it was outside the human being, and therefore it was one with the etheric body of the earth, which was stained with human blood at the killing of Abel. Consequently, in these events lies the Ahrimanic temptation, which we will examine in greater detail. Just as the Luciferic temptation came in the middle of the Lemurian era, in the middle of the Atlantean era came the Ahrimanic temptation, also called black magic temptation. The sons of Abel were able to offer themselves in an intimate, inner sacrifice in order to unite in communion with the spiritual entities. But to do so, they had to avoid uniting with the sons of Cain, who would have killed, in a certain sense, their clairvoyance. The angels and archangels revealed themselves in the soul of the sons of God and communicated the esoteric wisdom to them. At the origin of Atlantean magic stand the angels and archangels, who historically are mentioned for the first time in the apocryphal book of Enoch, which contains many excerpts taken from the records of the Akasha Chronicle, many episodes that are clairvoyantly drawn from the Akasha Chronicle. In the book of Enoch, the spirits of the oracles are called Grigori. Grigori is a Greek word, Gregoroi, which means watchers or guardians. They were the four angelic archangelic entities who had been sent by Jehovah to guard humanity, presiding over its evolution. The head of these entities is a spirit who in the book of Enoch is called Shemyaza. Some of these watchers had a Luciferic nature, but despite this, or maybe precisely because of this, they made it possible for the humanity of Atlantis to learn the first arts and the first sciences. And so in the beginning there is a balance between the impulse of these spirits, who are in any case directed to give, to pour the arts and sciences into the primordial humanity of Atlantis, and what instead prevailed later. Some of these Grigori, these watchers or guardians, descended more deeply into matter, descended more deeply into the human sheathing, and therefore fell more intensely into matter. It is as if they made the human astral body more capable of egoism, descending more deeply into the physical human sheathing to experience the sense physical in the way that was granted to human bodies on earth and mingling among men. This is found in Genesis chapter 6, in the first two verses that read, "When men began to multiply on earth," that is in the Atlantean era, "and their daughters were born, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took wives of their own choosing." So the Grigori, who because of this descent remained behind in evolution, united with the sons of man, that is, with more modern human beings, so to speak. In doing so, they brought impulses into human evolution that were anticipatory. In particular, they had an influence on the fourth Atlantean subrace called the Turanians, causing them to develop magic, but in a direction that had not yet appeared up to that time, that is, in the direction of black magic of the Ahrimanic type. So these, who were originally guides of humanity, sent under the laws of Jehovah, sent and directed by Jehovah, emancipated themselves, united more deeply with men in their astral body, descended more into the perceptions of the sense physical world, and there, in particular in the Turanians, they imparted a magic that became black magic. So, after the event of the killing of Abel by Cain, these obstacle impulses made a powerful entry that at first had a Luciferic quality and later opened up to Ahrimanic spirits. The Ahrimanic spirits settled more and more in the human etheric body. So now, not only are there Luciferic spirits in the astral body, but also Ahrimanic spirits in the etheric body. More specifically, this form of magic, black magic, Turanian magic, developed as a result of the emancipation of the oracle of Vulcan. This oracle had not yet completed its development because the Vulcan sphere would only be formed at the very end of Earth's evolution. At the time, being still in development, it was under the tutelage of the Sun Oracle. The Oracle of Vulcan was emancipated from the tutelage of the Oracle of the Sun and was irregularly united with the Oracle of the Moon. We can also say thus, the Turanians, as black magicians, operated a wicked union between the technology Oracle of Vulcan and the reproduction Oracle of the Moon in an early form that led to the decadence of both. This also meant that from this, which we can call the first form of eugenics, specifically Atlantean, those who were born from this union were Atlanteans in whom the sphere of thought and that of will had united in the absence of a sphere of feeling. The Atlanteans of this lineage, originated by Turanian black magicians, were fundamentally capable of bringing irregular spirits, spirits of obstacles, into the Atlantean evolution. These did not have the sphere of feeling, the sphere in which the Atlanteans interwove the most, in which they perceived the wise laws of nature and the spiritual entities behind nature. This hybrid lineage of Atlanteans is called in the Book of Enoch the Nephilim, which we have already heard about as we have the Gregory. The Nephilim, in a certain sense, anticipated evolution by many thousands of years in an irregular way. In Genesis 6, verses 3 to 8, we read, "Then the Lord Jehovah said, My spirit will not always remain in man, for he is flesh, and his life will be 120 years. There were the Nephilim, which is also translated with the giants, on the earth in those times, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children with them. These are the heroes of antiquity, famous men." So the Nephilim, the first Atlanteans, had giant dimensions, had 6 fingers, so they were hexadactylous, and were endowed with enormous capacity. We can say an excess of etheric forces, which allowed for vast, almost limitless magical action and nature. The majority of these giants had a demonic tendency, and therefore powers that were fundamentally destructive and seductive for humanity. In Indian mythology, they are called Rakshasa. So we find Nephilim in Jewish literature. We find them as giants in Greek and Latin, and they are called Rakshasa in Indian literature. They are therefore Ahrimanic spirits who manifested themselves through hybrid Atlantean bodies produced by the union of the initiates of the oracles of Vulcan with those of Moon in an irregular way. Their main impulse is that of uniting thought and will without feeling, and therefore induce possession and power, the exercise of power, over others and over the world, acting in a completely immoral manner. They are called giants, and we find traces of such beings in the sacred texts of all humanity, just as there are traces of the flood in archaeological evidence as well as in ancient legends. Once the Nephilim appeared, many Atlanteans of different races began to worship them as true divinities, believing them to be the successors of the Gregory, of those who were the regular initial angels and archangels, so to speak. But in the majority of cases, these giants were actually usurpers. So the evil Nephilim gained more and more power over the Atlanteans and began to seduce and overwhelm Atlantean humanity, corrupting it and causing its fall. They investigated wars among the peoples of Atlantis and plunged civilization into chaos. It was, for instance, the giants who taught humanity to ride horses and use them in war, horses that had originated right on Atlantis. The influence of this evil Nephilim lineage on the souls of the ancient Atlanteans was the cause of the destruction of Atlantis and of the end of the Atlantean era itself. If we want to have a reference in the movie culture, the plot of the film Noah, starring Russell Crowe, if you're interested, is based precisely on these events described in the Book of Enoch, which are recorded in the Akasha Chronicle and then reported in those apocryphal texts. It speaks clearly on the sons of Abel, the sons of Cain, of Grigori, Shemyaza, and then obviously of the Nephilim. It was with this decadence of the Atlantean civilization due to alterations of the etheric ore of the earth. Let's keep in mind that the Ahrimanic spirits enter the etheric body of man and therefore the etheric body of the earth, causing imbalance in the etheric ore of the earth, that the great flood was unleashed to purify the earth, now corrupted by the Ahrimanic impulse brought by the evil Nephilim, by the evil giants. Humanity could survive and start again after the catastrophe of Atlantis, thanks to the lead of Noah, who is the Manu, the beloved son of God of the Abel lineage. More precisely, as we read in the Book of Enoch, it was the four guardian archangels of the earth, namely Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel, who fought against the fallen angels, this fallen Grigori, let's say, and against the Nephilim themselves, and led humanity safely to the Manu, gathering humans from the four corners of the earth, because Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel form a cosmic cross across the earth. In this way, they allowed the migration flow to disperse in a cross, so to speak, from Atlantis toward the rest of the lands that would be saved from the great flood. However, since the sons of God, or of Abel, had learned not only from the Nephilim, falling because of this, but at first directly from the angels, the regular archangels, the original Grigori, the esoteric wisdom of Atlantis survived the flood and was preserved by the initiates of the ancient mysteries, as we've said, and was gradually imparted also to the sons of Cain in a form suitable for later epochs. The Atlanteans who were seduced by the evil Nephilim, who, as we recall, are also called Rakshasa or evil giants, were almost driven to extinction during the subsequent eras after the Great Flood. So we can say that the Great Flood destroyed a large part of them, but some survived, and we find them mentioned in the Bible, for example, in the story of David and Goliath. But not only there. They are also found in the Arthurian legends around the 5th century, as well as in the legends of the traditional folklore of all peoples. They were not completely annihilated in the Great Flood, so in the course of occult history, they survived just as their magic survives. So the influence of these Nephilim, or evil ones, or Rakshasa, continues in occult history after the Great Flood. The black magic that developed parallel to white magic was indeed their doing. As Rudolf Steiner reminds us in the Temple legend, J93, The Rakshasa, or evil Nephilim, acted as seducers of humanity until the time when Christ incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth, when the regular union between the lineage of Abel and the lineage of Cain took place. A union that instead had been irregular at the time of the Turanian magicians, of the decadence of the oracles of Vulcan and the moon, when the Nephilim were born. In fact, when Christ descended into hell, as Steiner tells us in GA 93, he encountered terrible entities in the circles of hell. These entities held the souls of the deceased captive. Here we see Doré's image of Dante's Inferno, the circle of hell where he meets the giants, the evil Nephilim, the Rakshasa. So as Christ descended into hell, he met these terrible entities of obstacles that held the souls of the deceased captive. He therefore met both the corrupt spirits of Atlantis, the Nephilim or Rakshasa, and deeper still those of Lemuria. This because while spiritually passing through the surface of the earth toward the center of the earth, he went backwards into the ancient eras of the earth, from the most recent to the most ancient, going from the era after the flood, the fifth post-Atlantean era, through the Atlantean, the Lemurian, to the center of the earth. Thus, Steiner tells us the deed of Christ was aimed, in this sense, at nullifying the black magic activity of these terrible evil spirits, who were the seducers and corruptors of humanity since the dawn of the earth. This was possible because Christ descended in Jesus of Nazareth, and therefore in Jesus, the sheath of Christ, coexisted the priestly lineage of the sons of God or sons of Abel, according to the lineage that we find in the Gospel of Luke, with the royal lineage of the sons of men or sons of Cain, according to the lineage found in the Gospel of Matthew. However, we can say that this paralyzing effect on those ancient opponents of humanity is gradually fading. So, Christ has achieved this paralyzing effect by virtue of the fact that Cain and Abel are united in harmony in Jesus of Nazareth. At the same time, however, this paralyzing effect is gradually disappearing, and we see it today. From a supersensible viewpoint, we can say that in our epoch, the epoch of the consciousness soul, enormous influences come from the Luciferic spirits, but even more, enormously more, from the Ahrimanic spirits. And these Ahrimanic spirits have entered our stream of evolution precisely through the evil Nephilim, the Rakshasa. Why is this impulse of annihilation of the Rakshasa action by Christ fading? Because it is required that humanity today, in the epoch of the consciousness soul, actively choose Christ, and that humanity itself put in chains these spirits of obstacles out of its freedom, out of its free conscious choice. These spirits of obstacles, the Luciferic spirits who manifested themselves first and the Ahrimanic ones, will finally return in the times of the apocalypse, when false prophets will also appear, spirits that have fallen even deeper than the spirits of obstacles and who are called Asuric spirits. So the cult of the oracles of Atlantis, guided by the oracle of the sun, runs like a red thread through all human history and continues its action of proclaiming the truth of the spiritual world. This truth is that of the necessity to work for the redemption of evil, of the Luciferic and Ahrimanic spirits, and finally even of the Azuric ones. And we know that this is possible. The story of one particular saint in hagiography tells us so. Some of you perhaps have already understood which figure we're talking about. In fact, the majority of giants were evil, but in hagiography, in the lives of the saints, we also find the figure of a good giant. It is Saint Christopher, who carries the divine child on his shoulder, thus allowing him to cross the river. I have talked about this in another video that I refer you to, called Return to Atlantis, where I speak precisely of Saint Christopher. We also spoke about Saint Christopher in Milan. Saint Christopher, or rather Reprobus, the name by which he is known in legend, which means the one who is rejected by God, was one of the giants who survived Atlantis and who later, unlike the others who remained evil, converted. So this Atlantean cult of the sun proclaims that Christ gradually unites with the human earthly evolution, and only through him will it be possible to finally redeem a large part of these terrible spirits of obstacles, something that we can only achieve after the mystery of Golgotha. So the solar cult of Atlantis, or the oracle of the son of Atlantis, returns after Atlantis in all the solar tradition of ancient India, Persia, Egypto-Chaldean, Greco-Roman, and after the mystery of Golgotha, appears also in the Knights of King Arthur, the Knights of the Grail, in the Templar tradition, in Rosicrucianism, in the Anthroposophical spiritual science, and in what we call Manichaeism. These are all a continuation of the cult of the Atlantean oracle of the sun, in a new form that always adapts to the evolution of the souls that return, having had that experience in the past in successive incarnations, and take up the thread again. This is how the Hierophants of Atlantis return from epoch to epoch and continue their work. And this is how, from these esoteric currents, we can understand how to unite consciously, freely with the Christ that is, not I, but Christ in me. And thanks to the forces that emanate from him, since the mystery of Golgotha, we become capable of redeeming even the most terrible spirits of obstacles. With this, I thank you for listening. Even if today I didn't see anyone, apart from Kata, maybe a little at the beginning and now, I hope that several aspects have been clarified to you, and perhaps others have expanded, also in regards to the book of Enoch. See you all next week for our next meeting.